So up to you. Certainly welcome to be here and glad you're here, but just FYI, if you're interested and you say, I've already done this, then that's the one to be at, I think. And of course, anybody's welcome here. I'm not going to throw everybody out.
What is the difference you're seeing between the two talks?
This was more of a beginner, more about let's start from the beginning. I've heard of it, but now I want to know what it is and really go back to basics. Building one, talking about it, working as a group, working as a team, and putting one together. So each of you are at a table. Consider that to be your team. So I want you to take a few minutes and just introduce each other to everyone at your table. Get to know everybody.
Hi team. I'm Jerry. Meet you. And yours are Edward and Ty.
Okay. Yeah. He's going to help you cheat. So there are some handouts. You don't need them immediately, but when we get to certain points of drawing a diagram or talking about identifying threats, they can be helpful.
Great talks.
Okay, so this talk was originally a talk, actually, I've given before. And when I presented it, or rather submitted it as a talk, I think it was Brooke who came back to both Jono and I and said, we'd like to turn yours into workshops. So, okay, great. So here we are. There's a mixture of the original talk in terms of the mindset and so forth, but then there's also some items that are specifically about a workshop. So this really is truly a hands-on workshop. The idea is to work together, to communicate, to talk. It seems like so long since we've been able to do this, right? I don't know about you, but so much of this has been virtual for the last few years. So it's I think, a cool opportunity just to work with some people in the room together, thinking about threat models, building out some ideas about threats and so forth. So very cool opportunity. So agenda, just very briefly, who am I? I'm representing my company, very briefly on that, and then just simply to dive in, what are we doing today, and looking at the rest, threat modeling mindset, and the process, which is really the learning and exercises. So myself, Robert Hurlbut, I am a principal application security architect at Acquia. I've been there now for 2 years. But I do a few other things. I am a co-host of the Application Security Podcast. Anybody familiar with that podcast? Okay, a few of you. Some of you, like Tanya was just on just recently. That's out there. I think it's been published. So we've been doing that. Chris and I have been doing that for almost 7 years, I think, since 2016. So a lot of great material. I absolutely encourage you and invite you to go take a look at it. Co-author of the Threat Modeling Manifesto, co-founder of the Threat Modeling Connect. And then also this year, I've started as a PhD student. I'm looking at space cybersecurity as another potential career in the future. And then previously, I alluded to this earlier, but I was at Bank of America for a number of years. I ran the threat modeling program there. We were able to, in a large organization, see thousands and thousands of threat models done. Lots and lots of developers, as you can imagine. So a lot of fun there. And a lot of great opportunities. So that's a bit about my background. As I mentioned, I'm with Acquia, which is just a small consulting company, mostly public sector. We do zero to FedRAMP, we do zero to SOC 2, and of course threat modeling. And we work with a number of different organizations, government agencies, and so forth. All right, so what is it we want to do here, and what do we want to get out of this? First of all, the theme of the entire conference is threat modeling is for everyone. And so how many of you are any developers? Oh, excellent. Fantastic. How many of you are maybe architects or, let's say architects. Okay. How about ops or DevOps or some way of operations? Okay, so maybe some hands will go up twice. That's all right. Actually, John just mentioned in the last at lunch, sales. Anybody in sales? So we should have sales folks in the room as well. Testers, QA, any folks that are doing that sort of work? Okay. I think you're doing everything, it sounds like. Are you the president and the CEO? No. Oh, there you go. So I've been in that position before. Let's see, what else? Well, security folks. How many security folks? All right, excellent. And threat modeling, are you already doing threat modeling? Okay. So how many of you, this is new? Threat modeling is new. All right, a few of you. Well, fantastic. Well, welcome. This is the right place to be, as we're going to be doing an introduction, or giving an introduction. And so then, as it mentions here, develop a threat modeling mindset through hands-on learning about threat modeling process. So, threat modeling mindset. This idea of a mindset, I think that in terms of threat modeling, it is a way of thinking. It's a thinking tool, first and foremost. Sometimes when we think about security tools, we can kind of get hung up on the fact that a lot of tools make it almost easy, if you will. I fire up the tool, I push the button, and it does something for me. And I get a response, I get, these vulnerabilities found, or these issues noted, and I might get some pretty reports that I send around that nobody reads, and that sort of thing, right? But threat modeling, on the other hand, is hopefully not quite that, and typically not. It is more of a thinking tool. Now, there are some good tools out there. I won't be covering the tools in this talk. We're really getting down to the basics here. There are some good tools that can help you think about or recognize some possible threats based on diagrams that you draw, or based on some input that you put in terms of, this is my system, it's got a web application, I'm on the cloud, I do this, and it says, okay, these are probably the possible threats that you have. So there are some really good tools that will do that. But ultimately, you're still evaluating the results. You're still thinking about, does this really apply to me? Does this apply to my team? Do we need to think about it? Do we need to do something about it? And so on. And so that's a big part of what I want to get across, is threat modeling is a mindset. It's changing the way you're thinking, if you haven't thought about that before, or enhancing and expanding the way you're thinking. Because reality is, many of us already think this way. Sometimes, in fact, we talked about that this morning in the keynote, where in some cases, for many, you hear them say, I was doing threat modeling, but I didn't know that's what it was called. We didn't call it that. It's architecture or some kind of review or whatever. We're already doing that. So it is a mindset. It is a way of thinking. And so that's what a big part of this particular workshop is, to help you hone in on some of those thinking skills or build some new skills. And this is something that you can take back with you to wherever you're going after the conference. So we like to say that threat modeling is something we're already doing. For example, when we lock doors to our house or windows, when we're locking the doors to our car or crossing the street. We're building a threat model, a mental model of what could go wrong, what could happen if I'm, my personal safety, my security. I'm already doing that. It's more intuitive than anything else. We're not sitting down, let me write out a threat model for me crossing the street. We don't really do that. But we do think about those things because we've already, in some ways, maybe we're already trained in it. They'll always look both ways when you cross the street. You already know that, but there's a reason for that. And it is a model that you've already built in, and it's how you do things because it's just built in. Well, when we think ahead on what could go wrong, ask those what-if questions, we weigh risks and act accordingly, we're doing a kind of threat modeling. It's helping us to think about how or what could happen, how do we then sort of do things in relation to those things that we've thought about, the things that can go wrong, and how do we act and react accordingly. So a big first part of the threat modeling mindset is being strategic versus reactive. It's thinking ahead. That's ideal. Thinking ahead. What could happen? What could go wrong? What do I need to think about here? And it's interesting, it's versus that wait and hope. How many of you have seen programs that are wait and hope still? Yeah, there are quite a few that are out there. No, instead it's strategic. That's what we want. We want to be strategic with our threat modeling mindset. So the Threat Modeling Manifesto came out in 2020. There were a number of us that gathered together to think about threat modeling. We had all came from different areas, some speakers and authors and others, academia, who came together and said, let's try to figure out the basic ideas of threat modeling to make it easy for folks to get started. And so these were a few things that we came up with. This definition, threat modeling, is analyzing representations of a system to highlight concerns of security, about security and privacy characteristics. And so representations, it's, as I said before, there are a lot of good security tools that do scanning or code review and all kinds of things like that. We're not necessarily hitting the exact system. We're analyzing a representation of that system. And that representation could be a description. What are you working on? What are you doing? Or it could be a diagram that might help us out as well. And of course, the system, that's important. What is my system that I'm concerned about? And then those concerns, the security characteristics or any privacy characteristics. And then at its highest level, we really focus on these 4 questions. What are we working on? What do we care about? And that's a good one to start with, just to think about scope. We don't necessarily want to cover everything. We're not. I think there was over here at lunch. There was not to boil the ocean, or maybe it was back there. I know one of these tables. We're not trying to do everything. We're trying to figure out in this system what are some areas or what are some things that I'm concerned about. And sometimes it may be existing system, and it's too much. Maybe I can get a high-level view and then just focus in on some areas of critical concern or maybe new features. And so that's really the first question is, what are we working on? Second is, what could go wrong? We've been saying that a few times, and that's where we identified the threats. I've thought about how this should work, but what if it doesn't work that way? What if something counters that? What if something compromises that in some way? And then what are we going to do about it? That's where we focus on the countermeasures, mitigations, security controls. And then do we do a good enough job? You go back and review. Is there anything I missed? Is there anything that sometimes you notice a threat will point to another threat, or a mitigation will open the possibility of 2 more threats? And so you go back and review and see if there's anything that you missed. And then you feel pretty confident. I think I've done a pretty good job for this threat model. I'm done. I'm ready to go. Are you done? Anybody? No, not really. Reality is that threat models will change. They will evolve. Just like, I have not seen yet any development shop or any product shop say that we're done. No more. No, they're always responding to customers, or they're always thinking about new features and potentially adding new attack points, entry points, and so forth that could turn into new threats. And so your threat model will change. It will evolve. And so just be aware of that. It is something that you continue to do. The other thing I would say, and this is from experience, years of experience, is that the first time that you're starting to put together a threat model and you say, well, I found a few threats, and then somebody else says, well, I found a few more, don't feel bad. It's one of those things where you get better and better as you go along, and you're not going to find everything. We make mistakes. All of us do. Or we don't see things. But having a team together, that's why I always say that threat modeling is a team sport, just like security and everything else we say is a team sport. But I think especially threat modeling, because we all come at this with different perspectives, different focus, different areas of skills and so forth. And that helps us together to try to build a really good threat model that's representing the different areas of focus. And that's good. And so don't be discouraged if you say, well, I didn't, some team found these things and I didn't. Don't be discouraged. As you continue to improve your threat model, you'll learn more, you'll get better at finding some things. And it's not really a better or worse type of thing. It's just a matter of learning more and being more comfortable in finding some things. So typically a threat model consists of these items. That system representation, again, it could be a description, it could be a diagram or a combination. Identified threats, whatever threats you've noticed. any mitigations that you propose, maybe some that are already in place, maybe sometimes new ones that you determine. And then sometimes you'll also, it may lead you to risk. It may determine that, there's so many things here, I've got to sort of break this down. I can't do everything, and that's where risk can come in, and you determine what is the likelihood and the impact of some of these things happening, and then that can lead you to what's the level of risk for these items if I don't fix them. And so you can include that in your threat model as well. I like to say that threat models are all around us. We already said it's something we're doing in our everyday lives. But this is something that's interesting to me, especially now that we're starting to travel some more. How many of you traveled here from some distance away? All right. So maybe you can sort of relate to this. Catching a flight. That's my system. That's the thing I'm trying to do. What could go wrong? Anyone? You miss it. Yes. Delays, yep. You can miss boarding or delays could happen as well. I remember years ago, long before we were not traveling, doing that, going there and right at the door and watching it pull away. That was the worst feeling. Delays, canceled, absolutely. So all kinds of things could go wrong. Now, what are some mitigations? What can you do about those things? Yes. Set alarm, leave early, get there on time, right? Another thing you can do with delays and cancellations is simply bring a book. Just wait it out or reschedule. Sometimes you can just say, this is not a good time. I'll go a different time. Anything else to help? Yes. Airline cancels, right? Absolutely. I'm sorry. Or drive, yes. Just go rent a car and go.
Alternative plan. So in the event that you do this, then you've got Zoom or something.
Absolutely. I'd say, getting your tickets ready, prepare your luggage, but I like those answers as well. Just having Zoom, maybe I don't need to fly, or maybe I can reschedule in some way that I don't necessarily need to fly because I can't get out today because of weather or all kinds of reasons. And so as I show here, the threat models are all around us. The systems that we're dealing with and thinking about, what could go wrong and mitigations and did I miss anything? And you go back and update and so on. And again, that's what we're doing with threat modeling. And in this particular case, typically it's systems such as computer systems and so forth, cloud systems, mobile systems, and so forth. Okay, so let's talk about and walk through that threat modeling process. And so it's really a lot of it based on the 4-question framework. I start with 0. Instead of just 1, 2, 3, 4, I start with 0 by saying assemble your team. Who do you need to get into the room? Next is diagramming or understanding your system. So that might be, again, just descriptions, identify threats. So many different ways to do that. Document what you find, any of those threats you've identified or mitigations, as well as a final follow-up is validate, repeat, and so forth. So let's start with the team. So typically we like to say, get software developers and testers, architects, project managers, automation engineers, really anybody that has some interest in the system. And I find also it can be helpful just to get folks in who say, I just want to learn about the system. I found, project managers and some other stakeholders who say, I know generally how it works, but when they're a part of a threat model session, they learn a whole lot. And so I didn't realize it did that, or I thought we did this a different way. I've been telling everybody we did it this way, or something like that. And so in this workshop, we've already done this, and you've already introduced everybody. Did everybody get a chance to meet everybody? I said that at the very beginning, but let's do it for a moment again.
At the table?
At the table. Yeah, meet the folks at your table. If you want to, you're welcome to take them over to another one if you like, or hang out there. It's up to you. Or you can be a threat model of one. It's up to you. Okay. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. All right.
We are Team Ultimate Threat.
Ultimate Threat. Uh-oh. Some teams are naming themselves. This one is Ultimate Threat, just FYI. If you want to name yourself, you can go ahead. Okay. All right. So now you've got your team together. The next thing you want to do is, the getting started. And so really, you can just start with simple tools. First is just a diagramming would be good. Of course, if you're just describing, you can record that. But in terms of diagramming, all you really need is a whiteboard, which we have some around here. And that could be real or virtual. And again, the beauty of being in person, we can do that in person today. And then documenting, putting down what you find. Anything you note when you're talking with a team and asking them questions, how does this work? Tell me how this works. What does this do? How does that do that? And so forth. Or what do you expect it to do? And just document some of those things. Sometimes I find in working with a team and putting together a threat model, just that part right there alone, just asking, how does this work? I learn all kinds of things, not just for me knowing more about the system, but I also start to identify the threats. Anybody ever noticed that before in terms of talking with a team and finding those things out? It can start to help you ask the right questions for determining those threats. So record that somewhere. The simplest tools, Word or Excel or Confluence or Jira or whatever makes sense. But someplace that a team can then go back and review it is the ideal. So if it's Confluence the team uses, put it there. If it's Jira, if you need to turn some of those threats into tickets, do that. But somewhere that the team could then follow up with. And in this workshop, we're going to use some of these pads. Okay, so just a quick aside, there's a paper that came out a few years ago in 2015, Avoiding the Top 10 Software Security Design Flaws. Very interesting paper. It talked about some of the most common things like don't roll your own your own cryptography. Be sure you understand the difference between authentication and authorization, all kinds of things like that. It's really, really good stuff. The key thing that it really pointed out to folks is that you need to understand the difference between a bug and a flaw. A bug is an implementation level software problem, and a flaw is a deeper level problem, which is typically the result or a mistake of oversight at the design level. So design problems. And really in threat modeling, that's what we're focused on. We're really trying to look for design flaws, secure design flaws. Threat modeling is not a secure code review. We're not getting that detailed into what's already been done or what may be done. Typically we say you should be doing a threat model early, so there might not even be any code yet. But you're trying to ask those questions and determine those decisions that are either already been made or will be made. Have you thought about this in terms of your secure design? So that's what I like to take away from this particular paper is think about those design decisions that a team has made or will be making, and then help determine, is that the best path, or is there maybe an alternative, and so on. And so again, just a little bit of the differences. Security coding bugs are like coding errors, typically require developers to understand secure coding. They can be automated to find those things, and patching is less costly in production. On the other hand, the security design flaws are those errors in design, security requirements, and architecture. They need contextual information. That's where that moment of, or the several moments, taking the time to understand what are you working on, how does this work, that's where it's really important and crucial. And then no automation. Not easy to figure this out through automated tools, that there are some secure design flaws. For example, I mentioned already authentication, authorization, getting those mixed up or getting it configured incorrectly. We see that over and over again in the news with identity issues or authorization access control issues because they are really, really difficult to just automate and figure out that we got them wrong. And it's costly to change in production. So that's another reason why it's really important to look at very early on if you can. Another thing I'll mention is, in terms of the team, domain knowledge, team effort, business and technical goals, always keep those in mind. The purpose of the threat model is not to override whatever the business is doing. Understand the business goals and how that fits in with those and the technical goals. It's focused, it's a focus time, and then be honest, leave ego at the door, and no blaming. Very important. So many times I've seen, unfortunately, in some threat models where something gets uncovered. Oh geez, we didn't do that. We were supposed to do that. That's not the time to blame. It's the time to discover and improve and get better. So this is certainly a part of continuous improvement as well. Okay, so typically what you're doing when you're trying to understand what you're working on is document elements of the system and properties affected. At a minimum, document basic elements of how the system works and any security concerns of any properties. What would happen if? And that's where, again, when you're working with a team or helping the team work through these exercises, is what's the security implication of that and how that works? Is there any security implication of that? All right, so what we're going to be doing, our first exercise, is we're going to be drawing a data flow diagram. So I don't actually have a direct description of the system. I'll give you a basic one. But we're going to take some elements that are available, and we're going to make an attempt to draw a diagram. Now, don't worry about it being perfect or anything like that. I've put some handouts out just to kind of give you an idea of some of the basic things about a data flow diagram. But the main things I will point out, the external entity just represents something that you don't have control over. It's usually maybe something that's interacting with your system. So it could be a user, it could be an outside browser, it could be maybe something you're interacting with that you don't have control over. It could be somebody else's API, somebody else's service of some sort that you're interacting with. But the key thing is you don't have control over it. And that can change depending on your viewpoint of your threat model. You might be looking at your particular microservice and everybody else is an external entity, and then you switch, and now you become the external entity, right? So it just depends on your perspective. A process, on the other hand, is something you have control over. Those are the components you write, or APIs, or any other kind of application that you write that you have some control over. The data store just simply represents where data is stored. It could be a log file, it could be a database, it could be a table, anything like that. Data flows are arrows that just represent where the data is flowing through the system. And then the trust boundary just simply represents a dash line. It could be a box or dash box. Just represents that on one side you have some trusted, or inside, if you will, you have some trusted operations, and then outside or not. And so usually when you're crossing that trust boundary, there's some authentication that probably needs to happen, authorization that needs to happen, maybe some validation that needs to happen. It's not a firewall. Sometimes I'll see a line and say, that's a firewall. No, it's not a firewall. It's to represent in my system some areas of concern that I think when we're crossing a path and there's a different level of trust, that I need to look at that even closer, that maybe there are some controls that I'm missing there. Now, we're drawing a data flow diagram. It doesn't always have to be a data flow diagram. You can start wherever anybody is. If they've got an architecture diagram, take a look at that. A network diagram, you can take a look at that. The thing that I like about data flow diagrams, it helps you simplify a little bit more. It helps you focus in on especially certain things that maybe an architecture diagram may not. For example, log files. Who's dealing with the log files, who has access, configuration files, who is managing those, how do those change, and so on. And those may never come up, in some of those kinds of diagrams. So I find those to be really helpful in terms of where a data flow diagram can really help. All right, so let's see. So again, in terms of the data flow diagram, you're looking at logical and component architecture, communication flows, data that's moving and being stored somewhere. Here's an example, very, very high level. So users, this is the external entity that is working against a server in some way. It could be a web server, it could be a web application, it could be whatever. And then you have some request responses that are happening. You have here's some boundaries, and then of course an admin. So here are two users. The admin is setting some configuration. Maybe the admin is reading some logging data from the server. And again, you have that trust boundary around the server where there needs to be some kind of authentication, authorization, validation, and so on. Again, very, very high level, but it gives you an idea of some of the kinds of things that you're doing and the different types of symbols that you're drawing or using here to represent your system. Again, very high level. I don't need to know all the details, and maybe I want to drill in a little further, but this really helps us at least at a start where we're going. This is a very simple example, but expanded a little bit more. This is used using the OAuth Threat Dragon to draw a data flow diagram. In this case, I've got a browser, a web application. I've got a few other things that represent trust boundaries, and so on. How many of you have ever drawn a data flow diagram before? How many of you not? This is the first time. Okay. Welcome. And so some folks I want everybody to help everybody else, and certainly to contribute as you build out a diagram. So we're going to start our first exercise. So who would like to nominate somebody in your group maybe to be one of the main drawers, I guess? All right, excellent. Okay. And take some time, go to your whiteboard. And just to give you a little bit of background, this is a web application. It's got a few things here, and I've sort of divided them up, so I'm sort of giving you a little bit of a cheat sheet here, but try to draw this as best you can. Now, this is you're asking a team, it's a web application. We have various actors, internal, we have service staff. For external, we have users. For data stores, we have internal logs and databases, and so on and so on. So this is their description of their web application to you. As best you can, start to put together a data flow diagram, and don't worry about it being perfect, please. But just want to get sort of in that practice of thinking through what's the difference between an actor, what's the difference between an external service and data stores, and so on. So let's take about 10 minutes and work with your team to draw a diagram. And please, work together. Don't just have one person do the drawing. Yes?
Okay. I think we're about to leave. Forget about
Well, I walked around and I definitely like what I see. All right. Any questions about the diagrams you drew? Okay, that's okay. And granted, as I mentioned, that table over there is that, this is a little bit unfair, right? You're drawing from just some random description of how the website works or things that are in the website, but, a lot of times you say, this, you go draw it. But the exercise here is helping you to start to think about this, as well as helping others think about this, because sometimes I found in my own experience, a team knows the architecture diagram, but they've got all kinds of things like multiple web applications or servers or farms or whatever. And I just want to get it down to the basics of what this thing is doing. And so this can really help a team to do that, just to think through this process yourselves.
Is there a convention as to users go on the left and processes in the middle and third-party days on the right? It doesn't
really matter. I mean, I think it's more your own preference on what makes sense. I will say that one of them, probably the most difficult part, and maybe you tell me, was it just trying to figure out now where I draw the boundaries? For most?
Time management.
Well, time management. Okay, time management. Fair enough. And some people will say, start with the boundaries, figure out where the boundaries are, and draw some sort of a box of internal, and then the external and stuff like that. But then it can change as you draw your diagram. Like, oh man, I got to erase, I got to start over again. So it's really it's really preference and what seems to work. Now here's the diagram that's sort of what that was all about. Does that look close, and it doesn't matter if it's exactly close, but is that close to what you did? Something along those lines? What's that? There's a database here. There are logs here. There's intermittent data that's outside that's interacted by the partner organization. So did you feel pretty good about your drawing versus this one? Okay. Threat modeling knowledge. That's a very good prize. Right? All right. Well, thank you for participating in that. We got some more things to do here in a moment. So we talked about diagramming and understanding the system. Now let's take a look at identifying threats. And just to revisit our mindset, when we're starting to think about threats, we're asking those questions. What if? What could go wrong? And there are lots of other questions, but those are the main ones to help you get started. What happens here? What happens there? How does that work? What if it didn't work that way? What happens? And so on. So a part of the mindset is, first of all, we already said it's strategic. It's thinking ahead. It asks questions. Now, I don't know how many of you were in the lunch next door where they said, "Oh, stride! Don't talk about stride." I'm talking about stride. And why we start with stride is, I think, it's really about the fundamentals of security. It was originally put together as a way of thinking a little bit backwards from what are the fundamentals of security. So if you look at it, it's spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, elevation of privilege. But what are the properties that are violated? Authentication, integrity, non-repudiation, confidentiality, availability, authorization. It's the CIA, right? Confidentiality, integrity, availability. It's the 3 A's. Authentication, authorization, and non-repudiation can be sometimes called auditability. So it's really the fundamentals of security. That's all it is. And just helping someone who is not familiar with those fundamentals of security, stride is just a good mnemonic to get started. Does it cover everything? No. Is it limited? Yes. No question. But again, it's a good way to get started, and I still use it myself. I know many still do. I'm also of the mindset that whatever works, and use it, right? And there are other tools we'll show you in a moment to try to identify threats. But stride is a good way and a good place to start. Spoofing, pretending to be someone or something other than yourself. Tampering, changing data, modifying data that you shouldn't be modifying. And that could be in memory, could be on the network, on disk somewhere. Repudiation, claiming you didn't do something. It's really essentially the lack of proof. I have no proof that you did that. Or you can claim you didn't do it, and I don't have anything to prove that you did or didn't do it. And what we want is non-repudiation, which is proof. We want a log sometimes or some kind of audit trail. Information disclosure is providing information to someone who shouldn't be seeing it. They should not, authorized to see it. So that's, again, confidentiality is what we want. Denial of service, exhausting resources that are needed to provide service. And that could be not just an attack against the system, but it's also the things that we rely on, the databases, the other services. If they're down, how does that impact our business and our services? And then finally, the most severe of all of these, elevation of privilege. Adam Shostak, in his new book, Threats, he actually renames this. He calls it expansion of authority. So it's that more authority, gaining it that you shouldn't be to do something you shouldn't be doing. And so, allowing someone to do something they should or that they're not authorized to do. And of course, what we want is authorization or some kind of access control to be put in place. Now, when you're looking at and applying stride to a data flow diagram, we don't just sort of do these things in a vacuum. The reason why we draw a data flow diagram is, first of all, to help us understand the system, help us break it down, decompose it, understand the various components. Stride is really just a way of, okay, now that I know where there's some parts of the system, how do I then apply this to the system? Now, you can apply each part of stride to various parts of the system, either elements or interactions, or just simply the interactions. Just start with the interactions. So between, for example, here, the user and the web application, any of the stride apply. Now, I don't have it in this deck, but there's a matrix that you can look at that says, well, for example, the process, usually all of it applies, but for interactors, for elements that you don't have control over, usually it's potentially spoofing or repudiation that affects them or impacts them, right? I can authenticate that user, but I can't really do much else for them. I can know that they are connected to me or not. That's repudiation, but that's about it. So stride doesn't necessarily apply everywhere. And so there's some ways to kind of make this a little quicker. But the idea is to really think through, I see an interaction here. Is there a possibility of tampering? Now, in this case, if you notice in the diagram, there are no labels for HTTP, HTTPS, whatever, and that's intentional. The idea is to ask those questions. Oh, first of all, what are you doing there? And that might help you. But maybe the person doesn't know at all. I've seen that several times. Do you know how that's? No, I have no clue. I just know that we send data, but I don't know if it's secure. I don't know if it's encrypted. I don't know anything. So that can help you ask those questions as well. So just to sort of break that down, you can look at your diagram, and this is what I would like you to do when we go into this next part of the exercise. Don't just put spoofing. There's a spoofing attack here. What does that mean? I think Brooke mentioned at lunch, he saw a diagram where somebody had something like this and they just put stride everywhere. That's it. That was the diagram. That was the exercise. They were done. Stride. Don't do that. Be a little bit more specific if you can. And it doesn't, it's not comprehensive. We're not going to do every single threat, but just a few that you can think about here in the next exercise. In this case, spoofing. User could be spoofed by an attacker to connect to the web app. Tampering, requests from a user to web app may be modified. Repudiation, how do we know actions are performed by the web app? So, for example, logging or lack thereof. Information disclosure, setting and getting credentials could be exposed. Denial of service was what happens if that authentication service is not available. That was a good question earlier. This table, what is that authentication service? Is it a process? Is it external entity of some sort? And I said, think of Google, think of Facebook, something like that. That's an authentication provider that's outside of your control. But what if that's not available? Or what if it's configured incorrectly or whatever? And then elevation of privilege. Does audit data have access control for reading, for example? So there's some threats, some examples.
Question.
Yes?
So go back just one slide back. So you have web application and web service as one big circle.
Mm-hmm.
If we wanted to decompose that a bit more, like you just mentioned, authentication as a separate entity.
Sure.
Could we have authentication as a separate process if we wanted to get a more fine-grained?
You could, but think of it this way, though. And another reason why the way we focus on it the way we do is in drawing it is that a process is still something that we own or control.
Yep.
And so if your authentication provider, your team is doing that work, then sure, make it a process. But ask that question first. If it's something that we own or control, and control means configure it, we manage it, there's a lot of ways to say I control this and manage it in some way, then yeah, absolutely, draw as a process. But realize that once you do that, now I've got a whole new set of threats I need to think about. Because some things, if they're out of your control, you just have to recognize they're out of your control. You can note them as, I've done that where I've worked with an external vendor, and you try to get a threat model out of them, and they say, what's that? And so you have to then just say, okay, we know that data goes here and data comes back. We can't trust the data that comes back. We have to validate it. We know that when we send it to them, we ask them to use TLS 1.2, 1.3. They say, no, we don't support that. 1.1 is all we do. Things like that. Those are the kinds of things that you determine in your threat model. Okay, here's where we are. Here's what we know. Here's what we can and cannot do. And that, of course, then is going to go into, which we'll do a little bit later, risk, right?
So if this web application and web service both had a common authentication system that was under our control, it would be a third circle.
Yes, absolutely. Agreed. Oh, great question. Okay, now, as I mentioned, Stride is just one method. And typically, Stride is more AppSec or security focused. It doesn't apply everywhere. Lyndon, as we talked about earlier, in earlier presentation on privacy, attack trees, threat libraries you can work with, checklists, card games. There are a lot of teams that use card games to get started. Use case, abuse cases, many different ways. And this is by no means comprehensive. But figure out your particular situation, your system, what are some threats that you can think of. And when I've done brainstorming with teams and we talk about Stride, but they'll come up with other things. And it doesn't have to be, it has to be spoofing, and that's it. No. Some of these work together to make an attack, right? And so be a little bit creative on those is what I always encourage as well. Okay, so just an example, we're going to be looking at this diagram some more, the ones that you drew, or I'll put this up here again, but this is just a couple examples. Partner organization, communication to web services may be compromised, logs for web application may be tampered with, and as I said, it could be a combination of these, tampering, information disclosure. Not so important, it's just how you got there, but this is just a way that we got there. Again, it's optional, whatever way, whatever makes sense. So some other things just to think about in terms of asking questions: who's interested in this app and data? What are the goals? What attack methods? How any attack surfaces or other trust boundaries that are exposed. And so a lot of times when you draw your diagram and then you start to do the threat analysis, you may find, there's some more things I could have drawn here that I didn't, or I missed, or I didn't do it right, and I need to go back and review it and update it. I know this team wanted to restart. And that's okay. As Brooke Schoenfield likes to say, threat models are fractal. And I agree with that. It's not I follow the steps and I'm done. No, you'll get into step 2 and you say, I got to go back in step 1 and redo a drawing of some sort, or remove something. It doesn't apply anymore. It's out of scope, and so on. And so as you go along, it's okay to go back and update. It's okay to go back and review, because you'll know more information. You'll understand more. So it's quite all right to do that. And then, are there any input or output data flows missing? So those are some questions to keep in mind as you go through and do your threat analysis that might impact your diagram in some way or uncover some more threats. Okay, next exercise. Again, working as a team. Let's take 10, 15 minutes. And so if you want to, it's up to you how you want to do this. If you want, I think these are, Post-its. You can take them off and you can put them on the board if you'd like to keep it next to it. Or you can simply use this and read this or look at this diagram. But use another piece of paper and just draw a column and start thinking about some threats. So let's take some time with our teams and put together some threats. And again, don't just put Stride or spoofing. Try to think of some specific threats if you can. We're running out of time a little bit. So just a general, how was that in terms of thinking through that? I heard a comment here, that's a lot harder than using the tools to do it. Yes, it is. It's definitely exercising the mind a bit to think through this. Now, the reality is you can certainly go overboard, but you find as you continue to look at these, you'll start to think about, okay, I like what the team over here was doing, where you try to figure out, rather than do the whole thing, let's just focus on one area and work our way out and so on. So I think that can be helpful as well. Good deal. All right. So this is from Adam Shostak in his book on threat modeling. Threat modeling is the use of abstractions to aid in thinking about risks. Threat modeling is a key to focused defense. Without threat models, you can never stop playing whack-a-mole. And the key thing there, not just the whack-a-mole, but the key that I pulled out of this is the focused defense. And so I like to say that, back to my threat modeling mindset, is that I'm being prepared. I have a focused defense. And so really the next part is this thinking about some of the mitigations. Now, these are just some common mappings between stride and example controls, so identity assurance, authentication that we want, and so authentication based on key exchange, 2FA, MFA, and so on, integrity, data protected from tampering with cryptographic integrity mechanisms, and so on and so on. So lots of well-known ways of managing those. And in fact, in the handout, I gave you some examples, some of these examples in threat mitigations. And so what I'd like you to do, well, actually, I'm not even there yet. Let me get through these real quick. In terms of mitigation options, is you have some options. Leave as is, right? Just say, well, I know it's bad, but I'm going to leave it because of whatever reason. Cost, could be time, could be, I've determined the risk is very minimal, so it's really not a bad thing. Or remove it from the product. We realize that this is a bad feature, where we really can't deploy it as it is. Remedy it with a technology countermeasure, that's ideal. Or warn user, that's what I call the pass the buck. You go into a coffee shop and it says free Wi-Fi, but it's completely open. That's your warn user, right? You're taking on the chance of connecting that Wi-Fi and any other things that you're doing that may be wide open to every other user in that coffee shop. So that's the warn user. You can just simply say, there's an issue here, but it's on you. Now, you can make these mitigations and countermeasures part of your security acceptance criteria. So as you note what the mitigations are, those are things that you can go back and test and verify and validate that they are actually now a part of the new or updated feature set. Now, I won't go into great detail about risk, but essentially risk is that product of two factors: ease of exploitation, business impact. Usually when you're thinking about risk, it's what is the risk associated with the vulnerability and or threats identified? And also, if I don't fix them, what's my risk? If I note them, I find them, I identify them, and I also note the mitigations. What if I don't fix it? What's my risk here? Now, in terms of risk management, you can certainly use FAIR. That's a qualitative way or quantitative way of looking at risk. You can use just a basic risk rating. There are many, many other ways to evaluate risk. Again, we're not going into that in great detail today. But a threat model really can help you, and especially the mitigations that you've identified can really help you then determine the next stages of risk or thinking about risk. And so revisiting our threat model, we have those two threats we identified. Mitigations implement encryption, validation of message integrity, apply access control, and then we've determined some risk related to that. And then sometimes you might also determine some action items and questions as a result. Should we limit it to TLS 1.3? Maybe it's TLS 1.2 and up, or maybe it should just be TLS 1.3. Or maybe you need to review some other access control options and so on. So that may be a follow-up for you in terms of the mitigations you determine. Let's see. What I always say is at a minimum, when you're mapping these out, have the threat stride if you want. It's not absolutely necessary. If that's how you found it, that might be just something to include, but if you find it a different way, don't worry about it. Mitigations, any risk ratings, action items, definitely, mitigations to be implemented. So those are the key things that you want to include as you're building out your threat model. This is your threat model, not the diagram. The diagram is just a tool. It helps you think. It helps you pinpoint the areas of concern within your system, but it's not the threat model. This is the threat model, that identification, that enumeration of those threats, the mitigations that go along with them. We don't really have a whole lot of time for the mitigations, but I wanted to ask each team, give me one or two, just one of your threats that you found that you really like. This team. Okay, and what's a good mitigation for that? From the table. Anybody? Oh, very good. Team back here, just one of your threats. that you like? Okay, and what's a good mitigation? All right. All right, and the team back here? What's one of your threats you found? Okay. And what's a good input sanitization? Okay. All right. Excellent. And the middle table here, what's one threat you found? Okay. And what about availability? What are some solutions that you can think about? Cloudflare. Okay. Yeah. So something to check to verify that it's up and running and notify if it's not and so forth. Okay. True. That's a great point. It may be. It may be not yours at all. But I found sometimes even teams that say, well, I don't know, that somebody else handles that. But what do you know about it? I'll ask a team, what do you know about it? And they say, well, we don't know. Well, could you find out? Yeah, we can ask. We can find out. And I found that when they ask those questions, sometimes the answers they get back is not really what they want to hear. Oh, we're not doing anything. Oh, what? You didn't tell us to do that. I'm like, oh, geez. So true. So you can go back to the contract. So some of that may relate to contract negotiation or agreements and contracts and so forth or the contract itself rather that talks about SLAs and so forth. Yeah, absolutely. All right, great. So full circle here. We've gone through documenting some of the elements of the system, properties, threats, mitigations we talked about, risks, action items. Finally, we get to that, did we do a good enough job? And what we're doing there is reviewing and following up. We document findings and decisions. We file new bugs or new requirements. So many times when you're putting together a threat model, the result is a new requirement. A secure design change that becomes a requirement. Verify those bugs are fixed and the new requirements are implemented. And those can become stories. Do we miss anything? Review again. Anything new? Review again. And so really the idea is that a threat model is not a one and done. I know you probably heard that many times before. But when you're approaching it this way, it truly is something that continues to evolve. And you can keep track of that through sometimes versioning of threat models. You can keep track of that through just this threat model, this one new feature, in order to try to manage the timing, manage the work. But I find that if you've already gone through this at a high level, the beauty of this is that then you can continue to do spot checks, continue to do small iterations, and really it's more of an incremental threat modeling that you're doing as opposed to having to do the entire system. And I always say, start where you are. Don't worry about it never having done before. I've got so much work to do. Just get a broad overview, start there, and then just work with what you have and continue on. And if you have time, go back and threat model some things. But I find if you're focused on the main areas of concern and then new features, you're going to do a lot of good work and catch a lot of things, potentially, certainly improving overall applications and systems. Yes? Absolutely. 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 And it doesn't have to be so heavy. I mean, this can be, some people call this heavy, and it can be. I like, that's one of the reasons why I love to train developers, is because it changes their mindset. It's all a mindset, right? And so they can be developing code and thinking, oh, there's a better way to do this. It's more secure. Let me think about that. And they're the ones who are making the decisions. I know we as architects and product managers and so forth, we made the decision, but it's really the developer who's making the final decision about what they write based on requirements and based on their understanding of the security requirements. And so helping them understand, and as they look at the stories and implement the stories, I think pays dividends. So it's a great point. All right, so here we are kind of finishing out our threat model. Review, follow up, address issues in the next sprint, or evaluate if we'll fix in this next sprint or a future sprint. Okay, and kind of what I just said a moment ago, consider a baseline threat model of your project if you have never, ever created a threat model before. So again, just at a high level view, and if there's some areas, I think this was mentioned over here, if you need to just dive in a little further into, there's a web service here, or there's some API or something, maybe I need to see what's going on there. You can do that. Get the high level and then focus in on and zero in on some issues that you might determine or think about in those areas. And then update and review your threat model as you continue to add new features. And there we go, the whole thing together. And so back to our threat modeling mindset, the last thing is active. The threat modeling mindset is active. It's strategic, it's asking questions, it's prepared, and it's active. It's reviewing, it's follow through, it's not just a one and done, it's a continual thing. It's something that continues to evolve, just like systems do. Our mindset is ready to update our threat model, adjust our threat model as needed so that we're prepared and ready to go. Make sense? All right. So, to conclude, pursue a threat modeling mindset. Be strategic. Think of secure design before new features. So as those new features come up, think about what the secure design decisions that need to be made for those new features. Ask the what if and what could go wrong questions. Continually ask those kinds of questions, which can lead to other questions that you need to ask of the system. Focus on and be prepared where defenses may fail. And the reality is sometimes your defenses that you put in, if you're thinking about a good multi-level defense, is that sometimes defenses can be an indicator to attackers where you care about things and you may need to threat model your defenses. That's been something I've seen before as well. So be prepared where those defenses may fail as well, and where you may need to think about, what happens if they get through here, and so on. And then actively review, follow through, and repeat as needed. All right. Some resources, Threat Modeling Manifesto, some books, great books that are out there over the last several years that have come out. And then I would recommend these are a couple of other resources. Hacking Kubernetes, really, really good book just to take you step by step of actually applying threat modeling to a particular set of problems with Kubernetes. And this playbook for threat modeling medical devices is really good as well. And that's me. So any questions, comments? Hopefully this was helpful.
It was great. Are these slides available?
I will make them available if you either want to reach out to me, or usually I'll put them on my website, Robert Hurlbut. It doesn't have it there, roberthurlbut.com. Under presentations, you'll click on a link. It's just all one word, roberthurlbut.com is my website. All right. Yes? Why would it go wrong? Why would anyone do that? Yeah. Good question. That sometimes can also come into play with risk. So some things, let's just kind of play the sort of the mind game, I guess, a little bit. The why, well, what if it happened? Would that matter to us? And now ask the why. Oh, well, if it did happen to us, we go out of business. Okay, now what's the why? Or our reputation is stained in some way, and that might impact our customers' trust of us and so forth. Okay, now ask the why. So sometimes it maybe you just need to turn it back a little bit and get to the why is the result of this not doing that is why on the other side we may have actually should have done it. And then that's where the why definitely comes into play. Yes? I'd say typically major release. Sometimes if you're like some teams go by epics, so epic is a major thing, major change. So then I would say a threat model. Sometimes you can go as far down as threat model every story. I know Izar and Matt have said that before. Continuous threat modeling. I'd say somewhere in between. It's really what your team's most comfortable with. But I would say at a high level, just at a major feature, so major epic or whatever. This is changing significantly what we're doing for this product. That's a good time to review your threat model. Not necessarily. I usually will go into an old threat model and turn it into a threat model 2.0 and just go from there. So you don't necessarily have to revisit every single one or take that one area and just look at that. I got the thumbs up from Rook, so that's good.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Look at it.
Absolutely.
I'm really
Thank you.
iterative.
Yeah, definitely. Iterative, incremental threat modeling. If you'd like to learn more about me, my company, or anything that we're doing, we just wrote this white paper. That's up there. You can take a look at. But definitely get in touch with me. My information is back here on LinkedIn. Connect with me. If you'd like any presentations, I'll put it on my website, or just reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'll put that back there so you can grab that. But that's AWS threat modeling. We wrote that white paper earlier this year. But take a look. And thank you for attending. I hope this was helpful, and you can take it with you to wherever you are to share it with others as well. So thank you.